to have this framework of international law and human rights, which are absolutes. When Israel violates them, they get held accountable. When others violate them, we hold them accountable as well. But it is particularly important when we are funding them. Because, number one, it makes us culpable. It makes our government legally accountable and makes us complicit, which is a moral question as well as a legal question. But it also makes us vulnerable. So, you know, you hear about Israel as our great friend in the war on terror. Well, when it comes to making Americans safer, it's kind of the other way around. You know, the single most important reason, there's a huge number of reasons why people around the world really don't like us very much. And they really hate our government. And they really hate our government's policies. But one of the most powerful and the most consistent is our policy towards Israel. One of the things Ann Wright said today at the IVAW conference, which I thought was great, because she knows it firsthand. She was a U.S. diplomat for 16 years. She helped open the new embassy in Kabul in 2001 after the U.S. went in and invaded and overthrew the Taliban government. She had been the deputy ambassador in Mongolia for, I don't know, 5 years or something. She's a high-level, high-ranking U.S. diplomat. And she said, everywhere I ever served, the first thing people would ask me when I got to a new country was not questions about the U.S. relationship to that country, whatever country it was, but why is the U.S. so eager to do whatever Israel wants and to defend everything Israel does? That's what we don't understand. That was the question people asked in all these places. So the question of the U.S. relationship to Israel is something we are held accountable for. And that means we are at greater risk. I mean, like probably many of you, I've traveled in the Middle East for a really long time. I've traveled in the Middle East now for, well, several more decades than I like to admit. But I never worried about traveling alone. A woman traveling alone, no problem. An American, no problem. Jewish, no problem. It's never an issue. I never felt threatened. I never felt anything. These days, I watch my back. Why? Because the actions of our government and the claims that our government is a democracy where the people rule means that people in other places that have no democracy take that quite seriously. They believe our government when they say we are a democracy and if people didn't like it, they'd change the policy. People think that. They think, well, if you people didn't like the policy, you'd change it. So if you haven't changed it, it must be that you like it. So yeah, you should be held accountable. And I'm thinking, ay, ay, ay. You know, this is not good. So this is what we're facing. So the focus on U.S. policy, which is what enables Israeli occupation, Israeli apartheid, the denial of the right of return, this is all what our government enables. So I think the question of what we do in response becomes very important at the organizing level. This is one of the reasons why the U.S. campaign to end Israeli occupation, which is now by far the biggest coalition working on this issue in the U.S., it has about 340 some odd organizations, big giant church groups, little tiny solidarity committees, everything in between. The U.S. campaign's focus is on changing U.S. policy. So yeah, we'll endorse events that happen at, you know, a demonstration at the Israeli embassy or whatever, but that's not the goal of the U.S. campaign. That's not the main point. Around the flotilla, the focus was around U.S. complicity, U.S. violations of international law, the violations of U.S. domestic law by providing Israel with the material capacity, the weapons, the helicopters. We don't know exactly which kind, but I can guarantee you that those helicopters that were used in the for the commandos who jumped onto the Mavi Maramara were either Black Hawks or Apaches. Those are the only two war helicopters in the Israeli army arsenal. And they're made in the U.S., they're paid for by us, and they're given to the Israelis free. We are held responsible for that, and we should be. That's the problem. So for me, the most important response to the flotilla was not just jumping on board another boat and saying we're going to have another flotilla, but the challenge to U.S. policy that enabled that attack on the flotilla to happen. When the U.S. went to the Security Council and prevented the Security Council from having any kind of resolution, instead limiting it to a so-called presidential statement, which is supposedly important because it has to be unanimous among all the 15 Security Council members, but it has no impact. It has no force of law, unlike a Security Council resolution. It meant that the U.S. was providing Israel with no accountability, was ensuring that Israel would not be held accountable, that there would be absolute impunity for Israeli leaders, political leaders, military leaders, that they would not be held accountable for these violations. That, to me, was among the most important aspects of our response, was to focus on the role of the U.S., on the U.S. policy that enables this. And I still think that's the case. More important than, I mean, all the work is important. Going to Gaza is important. The flotilla, maintaining the flotilla process is very important to show the Israelis that we're not backing down after the attack on the Mavi Maramara. But for us in this country, what's different is that it's more important, in my view, for us to focus on stopping U.S. aid to Israel and BDS work, boycott, divestment, sanctions work in this country that aims at changing corporate policy and U.S. government policy. All of that is even more important than organizing another flotilla. So that's sort of my own take on this. And I think that it goes to the question of how do we answer the issue of, well, why are you targeting Israel? Why are you focusing so much on Israel? And there's so many other countries. It's like, yeah, there's a ton of countries that are violating a ton of human rights. And we oppose all of them. And we'll sign petitions and go to protests and all that stuff. But the U.S. is not using our tax money and our name to protect all those other violations. It doesn't mean the violations are any less egregious. It doesn't mean that the Israeli violations, frankly, are worse, quote, than other violations. They're not. They're not. They're killing far fewer people than are dying in Congo because of the actions of various militia and government forces. So let's not have any illusions here. This is not the worst international law violations in the world, but it's the one that we are the most directly responsible for. And that's huge. That's huge. So when we talk about it in the context of there's this global war on terror, there's the need to combat terrorism, and what does this do for the war on terror? It makes everything worse. It makes us more overtly targeted. What happened during Operation Cast Lead, during the Israeli assault on Gaza? You remember towards the end there were periods when Israel announced 2-hour or 3-hour ceasefires to allow people to run out of their house and buy bread or buy some water, because of course the water taps didn't work anymore. People had to buy private bottles of water. And what would people see during those brief moments? They'd look up and they would see F-16 fighter bombers made in the U.S., paid for by our tax money. They'd see TOW missiles being dropped by U.S.-made, U.S.-paid-for helicopters. Everything about that occupation and that invasion was made in the USA. So do we think that people there are stupid? That they can't read what the helicopters say when the helicopter says made in the USA? That they don't know that F-16s and F-15 bombers are made by Boeing? I mean, they're not as stupid as we are. We think that somehow it's not going to matter, that whatever our policy stated is, well, we're there to defend human rights. Oh, really? That's your definition of human rights? Yeah. You know, people are not stupid. People can read. And what we're seeing now is a global response to that. And I think what's hard for us is recognizing that while there's something viscerally important about a direct challenge to Israel, you know, whether it's protesting at the Israeli embassy or targeting Israeli whatever, the work that we do that aims to change U.S. policy, that means aid to Israel in the Congress, that means corporate decisions in the U.S. corporations that are profiting from occupation and apartheid. That means going after, using the BDS framework to go after local government affiliates, municipal governments. Here in Austin, I imagine you have a lot of parks here in Austin. There's a lot of cutbacks that are underway, but still, every few years you need to buy new bulldozers and backhoes and whatever for the parks, right? What about a year-long campaign in Austin aimed at educating enough people in Austin so that the local city council would refuse to buy Caterpillar? because you don't want